Well, to discuss that further, we're now joined Mr. Mark Sloboda, who is an international relations and security analyst, and he's joining us live now by Skype from Moscow. Mr. Sloboda, what do you make of the U.S. statement?
Well, there's really no other way to interpret the statements by the U.S. State Department spokesman, Tim Kirby, other than as a threat and a call to action. He intimated, or he said specifically, that Russian interests and Russian cities could be targeted by extremists, and that Russians would come home in body bags and Russian planes would be shot down if Russia's anti-terrorist actions continued in the Middle East. Now, of course, this also applies to the United States. United States' anti-terrorist actions in the Middle East. One would think they also make themselves vulnerable by fighting terrorism, by putting their military interests on the front line in Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. Unless we interpret this as a specific threat by the United States to use the extremist proxies that it illegally supports in Syria, illegally arming, training, and supplying proxies in Syria, and uses them or makes a general call to action for them to strike against Russia. And that this is a political rhetoric of the most undiplomatic and flagrant type that basically the Russian government is furious about these statements.
And then, Mr. Sloboda, we obviously have the United States proposing that 7-day truce versus Russia saying that, no, we need a 48-hour humanitarian pause. That's for Aleppo. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, both in Ukraine and in Syria, we have seen repeatedly, whenever the U.S.'s proxies allied with al-Qaeda, Ahrar al-Sham, Jund al-Aqsa, and other terrorist groups on the ground, is on the run, is being defeated, the U.S. Always then makes a call for a ceasefire. Never, of course, when its proxies and their terrorist allies are advancing. So I think Russia is treating this, especially with the recent incidences of the U.S. Attack on Syrian forces, providing close air support in the process for ISIS, and the hundreds of violations of the most recent ceasefire by U.S. proxies and their allies, that Russia treats all calls for ceasefire with a very high degree of skepticism and cynicism. It has said repeatedly that they will not agree to any long-standing cessation of hostilities or ceasefire until Obama lives up to his repeated promises for over half a year now and separate his illegal proxies from their al-Qaeda and other terrorist allies. And it is undoubted, it has been repeatedly proven that such forces, both the U.S. proxies and their allies, only use these ceasefires and cessation of hostilities to regroup, rearm, and reinforce their forces, and Russia simply can't afford that anymore.
Very well. We'll leave her there at that point, but of course, as always, Mr. Sloboda, we appreciate your insight. Well, to discuss that further, we're now joined Mr. James Petras, who is a Middle East expert, and he's joining us live now via Skype from New Jersey. Mr. Petras, how important is this fight surrounding Aleppo?
Well, it's very clear that the government in Damascus is making progress, aided and supported by its allies. I'm talking about Hezbollah, I'm talking about Iran, I'm talking about Russia. They have defeated effectively the U.S. efforts to utilize the terrorist invaders as a proxy for their own conquest of Syria. I don't think the U.S. is in a position to sustain this offensive. I think they are clearly falling back in retreat, and I think it won't be very long unless that the Syrian government will eventually conquer and reintegrate Aleppo into the nation state. I think the main danger today is the wild language that's coming out of the State Department, which bodes for a confrontation between U.S. military and Russian and Syrian forces. I think this is a real threat of a nuclear war, and I don't think one should take it lightly. We have a State Department today which reflects policies which have nothing to do with diplomacy, which have nothing to do with peace. It comes out off of a very extreme outlook, and I think we should be very careful in looking at this situation.
Mr. Petrus, it seems that ever since the Syrian army worked to liberate all of Aleppo, the words and rhetoric coming out of Washington have become ever more so, as you said as well, almost hyper and very negative, and the propaganda has increased. Why is that, do you think?
Well, I think the U.S. does not want to suffer a historical defeat. It started the war, it's promoted the war, and it's suffering the consequences now. I think that Mr. Obama is trying to bolster the image of Hillary Clinton. I think the U.S. elections are playing a role here. Washington made another mistake, as it made in Iraq, as it made in Lebanon, of backing these terrorist forces, which are totally incapable of securing any substantial and sustainable territory. So I think it's a question of losing face, losing a point in the electoral debate, and I think it's very dangerous for Washington to put electoral considerations above the world peace circumstances.
Okay, we'll leave it there at that. But of course, as always, Mr. Petrus, we appreciate you taking your time out to speak to us here at Press Time.
Back on a Friday morning with some of the investigation into a mysterious death of two sisters from Minnesota during a dream vacation in the Seychelles.
This morning, their family, desperate for answers, is speaking out for the first time, and autopsy results have just been released as well. NBC's Janet Shamlian is following this story from Minneapolis. Janet, good morning.
Savannah and Matt, good morning to you. Yes, these are just in, and they indicate that both women died from excess fluid in the lungs. Now, that can develop in a variety of ways, anything from pneumonia to exposure to toxins or drugs. And toxicology reports, which would reveal more, are not in yet. It has been more than a week since these sisters died, and family here say they still have very little information from official sources.
This morning, the mystery deepens on a remote tropical island in the Indian Ocean. The Seychelles Islands, among the most luxurious vacation spots on Earth. But for two sisters who grew up in Minnesota, the trip was paradise lost. Annie and Robin Corky were found dead in their $1,800 a night villa last week. Resort workers say the women had to be helped to their room the previous night after a day of drinking. This morning, their brother Chris telling NBC News, the family is devastated. Everyone is in shock, and we're just looking for answers. He also told us his mother and brother are now in the Seychelles to press officials for information because, he says, we've been told very little. 37-year-old Annie worked for J.P. Morgan Chase in Denver and was on a figure skating team there. And 42-year-old Robin, a trader in Chicago, were self-described best friends on the trip of a lifetime. They'd been traveling almost a month, starting with an African safari, then moving to the island chain, staying at the exclusive Maya Luxury Resort and Spa. Annie posted this photo from the private pool of her hillside villa, writing, "It's indescribable, seriously." Local police report the women were found in the same bed with no signs of violence or trauma. Calling them seasoned world travelers, brother Chris Corky says they knew how to take care of themselves.
And the sisters were just 2 days from returning from that vacation when they died. Family members are now trying to bring them home, but there is no timetable for that. Matt and Savannah, back to you.
All right, Janet Shamlian, thank you.
The decision to release the video of Tuesday's officer-involved shooting was not made in a vacuum. Rather, it was a collaborated decision by myself, District Attorney Bonnie DeMonis, Sheriff Bill Gore, the other chiefs present here, and foremost, El Cajon Mayor Bill Wells. We came to this decision based on our collective concern for the public safety in the community. My involved personnel include Officer Richard Gonzalez, a 21-year veteran, and Officer Josh McDaniel, also a 21-year veteran. During the confrontation with Alfred Alongo, Officer Gonzalez discharged his firearm, while Officer McDaniel deployed his taser. Our only concern at this point was community safety. We felt that the aggression of some of the protesters was escalating to the point where it was necessary to release some information. And truly, it was my hope to relieve some of that concern. That was the spirit in which that video or that photo was released.